The bells began tolling before dawn, and the first thing I noticed was that they were out of time with themselves, like two hands of an old clock arguing over the hour. The second thing I noticed was the shoes lined up on the church steps, a man's pair and a woman's, both dry despite the wet sidewalk, pointed neatly toward the red doors like they were waiting for the usher. I would have kept walking. I should have. But the seventh bell hit, and somewhere between the seventh and the eighth, the street went quiet in that way old towns get quiet, when you can hear the wires hum and the river breathe, and I knew this was where their footsteps ended. People around here say you shouldn't count the bells in St. Adalbert's before sunrise. If you finish the count, something finishes you back. That would have sounded like folklore to me any other day. But I'd driven 3 states and 1 lifetime to stand on that brick path, because a couple I used to know vanished in the space between those bells, and the police file had a note I can't unread. Witness states, I heard them speak after the last toll, but no one was there. I'm not a detective. I'm a man who made a promise in a hospital corridor that I would find an answer, or I would at least look in every room where answers hide. Their names were Thomas and Elena Voss. He taught shop at the vocational high school. She restored antique radios in a garage that smelled like lemon oil and dust. They weren't the sort of people who vanish. They locked their doors. They paid the water bill on time. They took the same route home from the Wednesday night supper, the one with the clams and the pie. That night they left with leftovers wrapped in foil. That night the bells rang 9 times. If you ask the clerk at the diner, she'll tell you Tom left his coffee ring on the counter, and Elena took 1 more napkin than usual. If you ask the usher, he'll say he saw them pause under the linden, the one that still has a ribbon from a memorial 2 summers back. If you ask me, I'll tell you the truth no one wanted. They called me at 4:02 a.m., a minute before the bells. I let it ring. If this story has a villain, it might be my sleep, or the way a man learns to ignore the past when it calls at a bad hour. At first light, I walked the same flagstones they would have walked, counting the hairline cracks like breadcrumbs. The church sits on a rise above the river, built when this was still a mill town. Its foundation stones chunked out of the same slate the river eats in winter. The bell tower was shored up after an earthquake in '63. You can see the steel collars around the beams if you crane your neck and breathe in the old heat. There's a habit people have of lowering their voice at the threshold, even when no service is on. I kept mine steady, because this wasn't prayer, and it wasn't trespass. It was a measure of distance, from the last place they were to the first place they weren't. The usher had a key and let me inside, because old men who've seen real storms don't argue with someone carrying a promise. The air was cool and sour with extinguished candles. Rows of pews like silent teeth. A bronze plaque near the narthex read, Ring out for the living, ring soft for the lost. On the 3rd pew aisle side, there was a small rub of varnish scuffed to the raw wood. If you slide your palm there, you can feel how many Sundays left their trace. I pressed my hand to it and tried not to imagine Elena's fingertips doing the same. What does a disappearance sound like? We describe sights, footprints, tire marks, a flash on a camera that didn't go off. But sound has seams you can fall through. The bells in St. Adalbert's have 2 ropes and 1 clockwork of master gear that stutters in cold weather and runs. Eager in June. I asked the maintenance man if the timing could slip, if the 8th could come late, and the 9th too soon. He shrugged like men do when they're afraid superstition fits better than the truth. They do what they do, he said. But last month the ropes twisted. Wouldn't lay flat again. I thought maybe someone pulled wrong. Outside, the sidewalk held the history that paper misses. A chalk circle half-rinsed by rain, flattened wax from a vigil guttered out, the smear of rubber where a bicycle braked too hard, and near the step, 2 parallel lines a shoe heel might make if someone turned and then didn't. Their shoes were set straight. That is the part that won't let me sleep. People who vanish don't tidy. People who panic don't line things up. Someone may be them, maybe not made it neat. When the bells rang at noon, the town moved like a coordinated breath. Shades lifted, shopkeepers paused. A woman in a blue coat stopped mid-crosswalk and looked up as if someone had called her. I stood below the tower and counted, old superstition in my mouth like a bitter pill. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 birds scattered from the linden 6-7. My phone buzzed in my pocket 8, 9. I let it buzz. Later, when I listened to the voicemail, I heard the tower gears like teeth on bone, and a voice I knew say my name in a way that made me younger and guiltier. There was no message before that in the log. The call time read 9 hours 0 minutes and 0 seconds exactly. I told no one. Not the usher, not the woman in the blue coat, not even the clerk with the coffee rings who would have told me a story to make the fear smaller. I walked the perimeter instead, because first search is a ritual. You expand in loops until your breath is a compass. The river's edge was slick and brown where the current chewed last night's rain. Under the footbridge, someone had nailed small wind chimes from soda cans and spoons, a make-do carillon that shivered to any breeze. They were silent. Wind had come off the water all morning. The chimes made no sound. I cupped one and set it swinging, and it shuddered like it wanted to ring and couldn't remember how. An officer, I recognized from a photo, the one who wrote the original report, came out of the station with a paper cup and a look like men wear when they've given interviews for too many years. He saw me watching the tower and said, "You're him," not a question. I nodded because I was. He glanced at the shoes still on the steps, cordoned off with a length of tape that sagged like a tired sentence. We dusted. Nothing special. No prints on the leather soles. None on the laces. As if they were placed with gloves or with care. He sipped his coffee. Folks take comfort in believing there's a person to blame. Some days I envy them. What about the bells? I asked. What about them? He said. They rang. And between them? He looked up at the tower, then past it, to the ridge where the quarry sits with its scar in the trees. There's a story, he said. There's always a story. This one says the original bell came from a ship that shouldn't have been in these waters. That's not in my report. I asked for copies of what he could give me. He handed over redacted pages like thin ice. Timelines, witness statements, a map with circles overlapping like ripples from a stone. The last line of the last page read, "Area of interest expands to include auditory anomalies reported by multiple residents within bell intervals." I traced it with my thumb until the ink smudged. That night, I slept in a rented room over the hardware store, the kind with a bed that remembers other backs. The town went quiet as only mill towns do, proud and exhausted. I set an alarm for 3:55 a.m. I set another for 4:01. When you've failed to answer once, you don't trust yourself with a single bell. At 3:57, a freight rolled through on the far tracks, a sound like iron arguing with its own purpose. At 4 o'clock, the first toll came, low and full, like the town exhaling. My phone did not ring. At 4:01, the second toll came, and with it, the smell of lemon oil and dust, clean and old, the scent of a garage where radios wait for their second lives. At 4:02, between the second and the third, a whisper pressed against the thin motel wall, as if the next room leaned into mine and said a name only 3 people ever said that way. Mine. I opened the door to the hall. It was empty and bright, with the miserable fluorescence towns choose when they've traded beauty for bulbs that last. The carpet carried a pattern like river eddies, too on the nose for my taste. The third toll, and the air shifted cooler. The fourth, and the wind chimes under the bridge finally remembered their job and cried out through my phone speaker like distant cutlery. The fifth, and my voicemail icon lit, people will tell you you're making patterns where none exist. They're right until they're wrong. I stood there with the door open, counting, listening, imagining the two pairs of shoes on the steps, pointing toward the red doors in the rain that pulled sound into itself. At the ninth, the building settled with a pop like a knuckle, and down the hall something metallic rolled and stopped as if placed by a careful hand. I picked it up. It was a small brass number plate, the kind you see on the back of church pews, engraved with a donor's name half worn by decades of coats. Only this one had been scrubbed clean to bright and readable, and the name on it was a last name that wasn't common here, but was in my phone log and on a pair of drivers' licenses that had never been recovered. Voss. Tomorrow I'd go to the linden tree and measure the shadow at noon. I'd ask the bellkeeper to show me the master gear. I'd call the number back at precisely the wrong time to see what answered. But in that moment, in a hallway that smelled like old soap and older decisions, I understood two things. The first, some places hold an echo like a grudge. The second, if you finish the count alone, you don't stay that way for long. By morning, the brass plate had warmed in my hand like it remembered being held, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd carried someone else's heartbeat up the motel stairs. I wrapped it in a napkin from the diner brown thin, the kind that leaves lint on your palms, and slid it into my jacket's inside pocket, where important things go when you don't yet know what they are. The clerk asked if I'd slept, which around here is what passes for kindness. I told her I'd rested enough to keep from saying the wrong truth to the wrong person at the wrong time. She topped off my coffee and set the pot down lightly, as if any hard surface might echo more than it should. A bell sound from a door sensor somewhere in back chirped twice, then quit, like it lost its nerve mid-greeting. I walked to the church before the first lunch crowd broke the town's hush. The shoes were gone bagged, tagged, or quietly rescued by someone who couldn't stand the way leather looks when it waits too long in public. A pale rectangle on the step marked where dew hadn't reached while they were there. You learn to read absences if you do this long enough. A corner of plastic tape clung to the iron rail and ticked in the breeze like a metronome that had forgotten its time signature. I held the brass plate up to the red door. It didn't match any mountings inside or out, but the font-thin serif, old-fashioned and slightly proud, was a cousin to the letters on the donor wall near the nave. Families repeat themselves in fonts and in habits. The usher arrived with a thermos and a paper bag of sugared donuts, handed me one with the warmth still in it, and unlocked the side door to the tower stairs. "You wanted the works," he said. "Most folks want the miracle. The works are what we've got. The stairs were the kind carpenters build for other carpenters steep. True, no squeak unless they mean it." Halfway up, a slit window offered a narrow view of the river, like an eye reluctantly opening. I stopped there to listen. In a well-tuned old building, silence is never empty. It's layered, a low hum of wood, metal, and air haggling over space. Somewhere above, something clicked once, like a pocket watch closing. The bell-keeper met us under the beams, a woman with a braid like a hawser, and a habit of talking to metal as if it were moody livestock. "Don't touch the gear without gloves," she said, handing me a pair that looked new, but smelled faintly of machine oil. The master gear was the size of a barrel lid, teeth worn bright where they kissed the pinion. The two ropes hung slack, coiled like sleeping snakes. I asked about the twist the maintenance man had mentioned. She nodded toward a notch in the beam, where fibers had rubbed hard enough to glaze. "They fought each other for a week," she said. "Then they stopped. Like they picked a leader." I asked whether bells could ring out of time without human hands or a bad clock. "They can sulk," she said. "They can drag. They can hurry for weddings." "But out of time?" "If they are, something else is keeping time." I watched the gear turn through a test cycle slow at first, then more sure, teeth shouldering teeth in sequence. The keeper tapped the frame in 3 places that made no musical sense, but quieted a chatter I hadn't consciously heard. "Old wood talks," she said. "You teach it to listen back." I asked if she knew Thomas or Elena. She smiled with one side of her mouth like the question tasted familiar. "Everybody in a town this size knows the couple that disappears," she said. "Before that, you only know them if they borrow your ladder." She pointed with her chin to a corner where a 10-foot aluminum leaned against a crossbeam. A strip of tape on its rung read VOSS in block letters. The glue looked old. The ink did not. Down in the nave, the light knifed blue through stained glass and laid out shapes on the floor that an artist would call suggestive and a farmer would call fine. I carried the brass plate to the 3rd pew aisle side, where the varnish had worn down. On impulse, I pressed the plate into the scuffed patch. It didn't fit no outline. No missing piece satisfied, but the metal settled with the wood's grain, as if 2 strangers had introduced themselves and agreed on a secret. I set it down and listened. Somewhere, a door hinge exhaled. Somewhere, a building remembered a footstep. I am not a man who hears voices that aren't there. I am a man who has stood in enough rooms to know when the room is listening to him back. At the parish office, a secretary with pearl earrings and a tennis elbow brace let me leaf through directories older than my better decisions. The Voss name ran shallow in these parts, 3 listings in 20 years, 2 of them spelled with 1 S and lost to moves. Elena's maiden name drew a longer line, bending through choirs, bake sales, and a scholarship fund that paid for kids with calloused hands to go where calloused hands still matter. There was a photograph from a picnic lawn chairs, foil pans, a priest whose hat did not suit the wind, and on the table a portable radio with its back off. Tubes like small glass cities. Elena smiling in the middle distance with a tiny screwdriver between her teeth. Someone had written 9 bells in blue pen at the edge, where the sky should have been. At noon, I stood beneath the linden with a measuring tape and a yellow pad. A shadow is a kind of timepiece that refuses batteries. I marked the tip of the shadow at the 1st hole and at the 9th. The town watched without saying so. A man watering geraniums missed the planter twice. A child holding a slush drink let the straw drop to one side like a white flag in a wind that wasn't there. Between the 7th and the 8th, a freight's horn bled through from the tracks miles out, late for itself by just enough to make a man doubt his watch. My phone didn't ring. Instead, the voicemail from the night before replayed itself without my thumb. The same gears, the same soft syllable of my name, as if sound were a loop I had stepped into, and the loop had noticed. I took the recording to the station. The officer with the tired sentence tape listened with his head tilted like a dog parsing a trick. He called in a woman from the county tech office who wore headphones around her neck the way paramedics wear stethoscopes. She ran the audio through a spectrum display that painted sound as geography. "There," she said, pointing to a ridge that rose like a knuckle between the 2nd and 3rd bell. "That's not tower. That's external." She isolated a slice and brightened it. Underneath, faint and pulsed, a rhythm, not human breath exactly, not wind, not traffic. "You ever stand between 2 metronomes that slowly sync?" she asked. "This is that, but with 1 metronome missing. Your brain wants a click that isn't there, so it makes ghosts." She paused the screen. "Except here, the ghost is making your brain. Can you locate it?" I asked. She frowned, the kind of concentration that steals years from your forehead and gives them back in wisdom if you're lucky. "If it's a leak from a device, we can triangulate with a walk test," she said. "If it's an artifact of the bell room, the echo pattern should invert as we move away from the tower." She handed me a small recorder with a red button and a sticker that read, "Do not drop," which is all a man like me hears as a dare. "Record the next cycle from 3 positions, under the linden, foot of the steps, and the bridge. Then come back. Don't count out loud." Don't fill the silence because it scares you. I walked out into a sky that couldn't decide whether it was done with the day. At the hardware store, the proprietor who rented me the room set a small bag on the counter with my name on it. Inside, a flathead screwdriver, a set of felt pads for chair legs, and a tiny bottle of lemon oil. No note. Some towns communicate like small radios, short range, clear signal, no signatures. I pocketed the oil, thinking of Alina's garage and the smell that had climbed into my room like memory wearing shoes. At dusk, the bridge took on that weight a structure gets when it understands its own purpose. I placed the recorder on the rail, pressed the red button, and took a step back. The river rolled under like a slow argument too old to end. The first toll reached us as a pressure before it was a sound. A breeze lifted the spoon chimes. This time they rang, thin and earnest. The second toll, and a car far off scraped a downshift that sounded like a man regretting something. The third, and there, on the far bank, two figures like heat in a mirage, the kind you see when roads dream. They stood where the path meets the willow's roots, and as the fourth toll pulled the air tighter, they turned in that synchronized way of long couples, as if one spine remembers the other's bend. I could have called out. Instead, I raised my hand, palm open, the universal sign for don't spook. The fifth toll, and the figures blurred, not away, not gone, just slightly misaligned, as if a projector had slipped in its mount. The sixth, and the spoon chimes faltered mid-ring. The seventh, and my phone vibrated against my rib like a small animal trying to be brave. I let it. The eighth, and across the water, the figures stepped not forward, not back, but sideways into a seam of air I didn't know a person could use. The ninth, and the willow's leaves shivered, then lay flat, as if a hand had smoothed a sheet. The recorder's light went from red to dumb. I picked it up and pressed play. What came back wasn't what I'd heard. The bells were there, sure as a grandfather's cough. But between them, a third rhythm, faint, regular, like a second tower counting off in a room, a fraction to the left of ours. And under that, lower still, a whisper of gears that didn't belong to this town's clocks. I rewound and listened again, forehead against the rail, the river answering in small licks against stone. The sound was a map if he knew how to read it. I did not. Not yet. When I looked up, the far bank was empty. The willow knew nothing. The path held only its own use. But the smell of lemon oil came across the water, clean and old, and the spoon chimes rang once, even though the air had gone still, and somewhere in the church, very softly, something counted one more than 9. By morning, the recorder felt heavier, like it had absorbed a piece of the night and wasn't willing to give it back. And the bottle of lemon oil in my pocket printed a faint, clean scent on my shirt that strangers would mistake for a good memory, and friends would know meant work to do. The officer called at 8:11 and said the tech wanted the samples before noon. Deadlines are just clocks with an opinion, and this one came with a tone that said move before the bell decides for you. I stopped by the diner for eggs. I didn't taste, and a napkin I did, the kind that disintegrates if you ask too much of it. And the clerk drew a small circle on my receipt, 9 tiny hash marks. Then a 10th faint, as if she changed her mind at the last second. Under the linden, the ground still remembered where I had stood, a scuff the shape of hesitation, and the shadow's nose measured the hour like a stubborn dog that won't be hurried. I recorded position 1, kept my breath in my teeth, let the silence be its own instrument. A truck downshifted 2 streets over, and for a heartbeat, the air held 2 tempos road and tower-like. A band where the drummer refuses the singer's count. At the steps, position 2, I put the brass plate on the stone beside me and set the recorder near it. Sound does strange arithmetic when it has metal to bounce from. Sometimes you hear what's not there, because the echo has a better imagination than you do. On the bridge, position 3, The spoon chimes behaved themselves like children after a warning, and the river kept its counsel, which is all a river ever does when it's seen too much and plans to see more. Back at the station, the tech slid the files into a program that looked like weather and war had a child together blues. Greens, sudden ridges of yellow, where the world got loud for a reason. There, she said, tapping a small repeated rise between tolls 2 and 3 that matched a twin hum between 7 and 8. Not tower, not traffic, not HVAC, that's a device, or a place acting like one. And she overlaid last night's bridge audio with today's. Linden take until the two graphs argued themselves into agreement. If you're brave, walk it with a directional mic at night, she said. But be warned, patterns like this don't just draw you in, they make you complete them. The officer signed a form with the care of a man who knows paper, is the last kind of memory a town trusts, then handed me a photocopy of something he shouldn't have. A supplemental witness note from years back, margin scribbled and never formalized. It read, "On nights with 9, folks say the 10th is for the river." Don't write that, Sarge. I'm only saying what they say. A second line below. In another end, stop writing what bells do we write, what people do. There was an address tacked to the bottom an old quarry road above the ridge, where the town's back shows its bones. The road up was the kind that makes your car remember every bolt, ruts like old arguments, scrub pine leaning in to tell you secrets they themselves don't understand. At the top, the quarry had filled with rain and regret, a wide bowl of water that looked innocent until you counted how many names it could hold. A chain-link fence sagged in a posture of apology. I walked the perimeter, recorder in hand, not for bells now, but for that third rhythm the tech had teased into view, the one that beat like a heart that had forgotten its body. Midway along the north rim, the air went different pressure in the ears, a hush that wasn't silence, but selection, as if the world had briefly paused everything that wasn't the thing I needed to hear. I set the recorder on a post and the brass plate atop it, and the plate sang back a note I wouldn't have noticed if the metal hadn't decided it had a voice now, thin as a hair and exact as a promise. The 10th knock bell arrived like a rumor you pretend to ignore, and in the water below, a circle widened for nothing. No thrown stone, no fish rise, just a widening as if the quarry knew a count I hadn't kept. On the far side, chalk marks on rock 9 vertical lines crossed by a 10th, the old prisoner's calendar, then a gap, then another single mark set apart, timid or proud, I couldn't tell which. I called the number in my log, the one that had rung at 9 exactly, and listened to the world decide whether it'd answer. It picked up on the half-ring the way only machines and desperate people do, and a coil spring sound unspooled, a soft rack of teeth, and then a voice said my name again. But this time it added one word more. Listen. I did. The line carried a room, large, wood, high ceiling, with the faintest flutter of paper hymnals or orders of service, and a smell that isn't a sound but sometimes is. Lemon oil and dust, the way a clean place keeps its history without apology. Elena? I asked, and the room answered with the tiny metallic kiss of a screwdriver dropped into a tray, which is either a coincidence or a language I was too slow to learn when it mattered. Then the call did a thing calls don't do. It stepped to the left, not a click, not a drop, a sidestep. The room became the tower, became the stair, became the slit window where the river looks up like a dog that knows it's loved and isn't sure why. Between the bells, the voice said, and I heard the word not as instruction, but as address, the way you call a person by the place they live when their home is more them than their name is. We didn't mean to tidy, it said. We thought neatness would help, and I could see the shoes on the step, pointed toward the door as if doors are only ever thresholds and never mouths. The line ended like a candle does when glass steals its oxygen. No fade, no stumble, just a yes turning into a no without discussion. The recorder kept on, making an honest map of dishonest air. And when I picked up the brass plate, it was warm again, warmer than any sun that day had offered, as if names can gather heat from being spoken by a mouth you can't see. Down at the quarry's lip, the chalk marks had changed, still 9, still the crossed 10th, but now a curve beside them, her emphasis to hold something that hadn't yet arrived, or to cradle a word that had been said too late. Back in town, I took the plate to the shop with radios in the window, 3 doors down from the barber, because there are places you carry certain objects, and this was one of them, whether I liked it or not. The proprietor was new to me, but not to the smell. He worked with the calm of a man who respects electricity's moods and the patience of someone who's waited for tubes to warm since he was old enough to be trusted with heat. He looked at the plate, looked at me, and slid a small chassis across the counter. "If she left you that," he said, "you'll need this." And he showed me a socket where a plate could sit not as a plaque, but as a bridge, completing a circuit that had been left one part shy on purpose or by mercy. "What does it do?" I asked. "Same thing bells do," he said. "It counts," and he smiled the way men do when they don't want to scare you with the truth. Too early, but don't intend to lie. That night I set the chassis on the motel desk, slid the brass plate into its grip until contact felt like consent, and watched the filaments wake one by one like a town turning on its porch lights. I didn't press record. Some things you meet without a witness if you expect them to talk plain. At 3:59, the room held its breath. At 4 o'clock, the first toll folded into the radio's small hum. At 4:01, the second toll arrived with a scent of lemon so clean a man could swear the air had been polished. At 4:02, a voice said my name, and then very softly, "Don't finish the count alone." The third toll came, and in the corner of the room, where the light didn't reach, something answered it with a 10th done early. I didn't count it. My mouth wouldn't shape the number. The fourth toll, and the radio speaker lifted an old hymn without words. Just the part where you remember being a different person in a smaller life. The fifth, and somewhere in the building, a door decided to be open. The sixth, and the directional mic in my bag clicked itself on. The seventh, and the spoon chimes under the bridge found a way to ring without wind at all. The eighth, and the filaments went brighter than they had any right to go. The ninth, and the porch light outside my window flared, then steadied, then went out as if someone had put a palm over it from the other side of the glass. And then, not a bell, but the shape a bell makes in a room when it refuses to be heard. Something stepped toward me through that shape, and the radio's cloth grill bowed slightly inward, like breath before a word that changes what you are to the people you love. The grill bowed inward like a lung deciding whether to breathe, and a small crackle ran across the cloth, not electrical, not random footsteps on coarse carpet, counted out of habit by someone who needed numbers to be a floor. The air in the room made a doorway of itself, not visible, not even colder, but structured, like a frame you feel with your shoulder before you find it with your hand. "Don't finish the count alone," the voice had said, and there are instructions that sound like superstition until the exact moment they are the only engineering you have. I stepped closer to the radio and spoke the way you speak to skittish animals and infants low, steady with no surprise in the syllables. "I'm here," I said. The hum answered by dividing 2 layers off by the smallest fraction, like a duet sung through 2 open doors down one long hall. The radio's cloth trembled again, then settled, and a scent rose that didn't belong to my room or my life, a faint burn of rosin, a ghost of hot tubes, and that clean lemon that had chosen me now the way certain towns choose certain men to do their chores. Sound will carry memory faster than sight. It hits the old parts of the brain that measure danger and home with the same ruler. Behind the bell's imagined shape, a lighter rhythm tapped metal on metal, not harsh, careful, like a small screwdriver touching a screw head and deciding whether to turn. Elena, I said, because there are names that work like keys, whether you believe in keys or not. The hum slid a half step left and brightened, and then another voice threaded through, lower, lined with sawdust and classroom chalk. We made a mistake, it said. We tried to make it neat. Where are you? I asked, and the question felt clumsy compared to the delicacy of what had just happened. Like asking a violin which shelf it sits on when you should ask it what room it remembers. Between, he said, and I heard his hand find hers in the way two timbres braided, then steadied, a private synchronization broadcast through a dime of cloth and wire. Between what? I said, and the tower far away answered for them, a single late toll that didn't belong to any clock in town. The chassis warmed under my fingers. Heat is honesty in a device like that. You can pretend the rest, but heat tells the truth. I slid the brass plate out, and the hum collapsed back into one. The door-shaped air forgot its lines. The motel's stale quiet returned, full of the meaningless noises of pipes and neighbors, and the refrigerator's moral struggle. I put the plate back. The duet resumed, shy at first, then certain, as if repetition is permission for the impossible. You left your shoes, I said, which is not a question, but in a town like this, it is an accusation and a confession at once. We thought neatness would be a map, she said. People look harder when you give them an arrow, and I saw the toes pointing to the red doors, obedient, hopeful, like church children in patent leather. We were wrong, he said. Neatness is also a kind of goodbye. And I had nothing to add, because I have been neat when I should have been messy enough to make someone stop me. Did you walk into it? I asked. The between? We finished the count, he said. We thought together would be safe, and the radio's cloth pulled inward once, hard enough that a thread popped at one corner and stayed there like a white hair in a dark eyebrow. How do I open it without stepping through? I said, and the room had the temerity to answer with a second motel door down the hall, opening and closing, human life going on with ice machines and keycards, as if counting were just for change jars. There's a leak, she said, and the word sat exactly right, not spooky, just practical. Every bell tower leaks a little, or the world does. We found one where two timekeepers disagree. The seam hums. You can feel it in your teeth if you're paying attention. If you widen the seam, it pulls. If you finish the count alone, it holds just you. If you finish with someone, it holds you both. Then why can I hear you? I said, because sound goes first, she said gently. And last. Tell me where, I said, and my pen was suddenly in my hand, as if writing might be a life jacket a man can throw across a door he can't see. Under the linden, when the shadow crosses the plaque, he said. On the bridge, when the spoon chimes ring with no wind. In the tower, when the ropes choose a leader. In the quarry, when the water counts without a stone. Between 7 and 8. Between 2 and 3. Between who we were and what we meant to be. The radio brightened like a thought right before it makes your face change. Bring someone, she said. Someone who won't finish the count. Someone who can hear silence. And I thought of the usher, whose hands had learned wood, and the bell-keeper, whose braid had learned rope, and the clerk, who poured coffee like a sacrament. The porch light outside my window clicked back to life. The hotel's hallway breathed once like lungs behind drywall. The duet wavered. The 10th is for the river, he said, and the chassis cooled under my palm, in a way that felt like midnight on a steel rail, holding a freight's rumor. Tomorrow, I said. No, tonight, because delays can be a form of finishing the wrong count. I packed the chassis, wrapped the plate in the same napkin that had failed me earlier, and headed to the church with the kind of walk that isn't haste but refuses to be anything else. The town at 11 p.m. is kinder than at 4 a.m. It has people in it who tell you with their eyes that your business might be urgent, and that this is a place where urgencies get their hearing. The usher met me with that two-step older men do when they are already on the way before the phone finishes ringing. The bellkeeper came in with her gloves on, like a doctor summoned from a movie. The clerk brought a thermos, and the understanding that some coffee gets drunk in rooms that will absorb more of what is said than the people in them can carry. We set the chassis on the third pew, aisle side, scuffed place to scuffed place, brass plate nested in its bridge. A keeper checked the ropes with a look that would have made a less honest piece of wood change its mind. The usher stood beneath the tower and closed his eyes, counting without numbers the way men who've rung bells all their lives keep time with their shoulders. Between 7 and 8, I said. Between 2 and 3. Don't finish the count. They nodded as if I'd told them to breathe when water goes over your head. We cut the house lights. The stained glass kept its colors in the dark, because that is what faith is for after illumination is done working. The first toll, and the radio hummed like a cat deciding to forgive. The second, and the spoon chimes, impossibly, spoke from the bridge a town away. The third, and the linden's shadow outside shifted across the plaque with the precision of a sailor's knife. The fourth, and the ropes twitched, no hands on them. The fifth, and the usher's shoulders answered anyway, muscle memory as ritual. The sixth, and the quarry water, far above us, laid down a circle no wind had earned. The seventh, and the air inside the nave framed itself again into that knot door a person can feel in the bone before the skin. Hold, the keeper whispered. Don't finish, the usher breathed, and the clerk squeezed my elbow in a way that told me she had put napkins in too many pockets on too many days like this. Between 7 and 8, the duet returned, clearer, closer, the braid of two voices taut as rope under weight. Now, she said, if you can hear us, you can widen it without falling through. You need a name, a sound, and a promise. The name to call the scene, the sound to tune it, the promise to keep you. Choose right and you'll open a window. Choose wrong and you'll make a door. What's the difference? The clerk whispered, and the radio, kind as a teacher, said, windows let light change a room. Doors change where you are. The eighth approached like a train that has written your schedule for you. I said her name, not as a plea, but as a summons, the way a bell says noon because it is noon. The bellkeeper tuned the scene with a tap on the frame where her hands had learned to calm old wood. The usher spoke the promise, simple as seed. We will not finish the count, not alone, not together. We will hold at 9, and the air in front of us went thin and bright. The 8th struck. We did not say 9. The radio sang a line of hymn that has no words. The scene widened to a window and held like glass that knows it is watched. And in it, not a picture, not a hole, just the impression of two people standing exactly where they would stand if they had kept their shoes on and stayed in this world despite themselves. Don't move, I said, to them or to us, I couldn't tell. The 9th gathered itself like breath in a sick room. We did not give it shape with our mouths. And the 10th there should have been no 10th rolled under the floorboards, like a river deciding it could be a bell if it wanted to be. And the window listened, then bowed, and then something stepped through that was not them and not us, carrying a cold like water and a sound like rope under a load. And the radio's cloth tore the rest of the way, one clean line from corner to corner. It stepped through like a draft that knew your name, and the nave took one collective inhale, the kind people take at hospital doors and courtroom thresholds. Before, sound remembered how to behave and laid itself back down in rows like hymnals after service. The tear in the radio's cloth wasn't jagged. It was a straight honesty, a surgeon's line, and the filament glow behind it made a narrow, amber pupil that looked at us without needing eyes. The usher's hand hovered over the rope and stopped short, old discipline winning against newer fear, the way a good habit carries a man through a bad minute. The bellkeeper shifted her stance as if bracing timber, a half step back, knees soft, like she'd learned to let falling weight choose her instead of knocking her off balance. The clerk set the thermos down quietly, and the tiny click of metal on wood sounded like a small permission granted by a large room. What came with it wasn't a shape, but an intention, the pressure. You feel when two magnets are introduced, and the table between them learns a new definition of strain. The air carried rope sound without rope, a low fiber groan that knows knots by their first names, and beneath it the faint machine chatter of gear teeth, counting a thing they had not been asked to count. Windows let light change a room, the radio had said a minute ago, and this was a window, remembering it could be a door if someone begged it wrong. Hold at 9, the usher breathed again, as if the words themselves were wedges to keep an old house from settling where it shouldn't. Between breaths, the brass plate warmed further until heat became instruction touch, but do not press. A line, but do not lock. Name, sound, promise, the bellkeeper said, with the steady calm of someone calling steps on a ladder in a storm, and her voice gave the air a spine. The name we had, the sound we tuned. A promise we were still making every second by not letting the 9th cross our tongues. The thing in the window resisted taxonomy. It was not a person, but it wore the trace of people, the way a jacket remembers shoulders after you hang it up in a house that outlives you. It moved like a draft moves when a building exhales, and with each knot footfall, the spoon chimes on the bridge rang once, polite, as if acknowledging a guest who hadn't been invited, but had brought a dish anyway. At the 10th that shouldn't, the radio cone drew in again, then relaxed, and a whisper slotted into the seam, the way a card slots into an old catalog drawer. Trade. The clerk's fingers found my sleeve, a human tether as old as boats, and she shook her head. The kind of no that isn't refusal, but memory she'd poured coffee for other bargains in other rooms, and did not like their arithmetic. Trade what? I asked, because questions can be shields if you hold them steady and keep breathing. The duet returned their duet, Thomas and Elena, braided and taut, and for a breath I heard the small domestic noises that carry more marriage than vows do. A drawer that sticks on humid days, a radio dial that stops one click shy of perfect, a laugh that has learned the other's cough. Not you, she said, quick and tender, as if she could feel the thought leaving my body and wanted to stop it at the threshold. Not anyone, he said, teacher steady, a tone that makes rooms behave. Then what buys a window without making it a door? The bellkeeper asked, and the room seemed to lean toward her braid as if rope respects its own. The seam thinned, then held, and in its glassless surface, I saw a sliver of the tower interior at an angle that wasn't physically available. From where we stood the ropes crossing, one laid over the other in a figure eight they shouldn't make by themselves. Untie, Elena said, so gentle it hurt, and the usher understood before the rest of us. He moved like a younger man, and set his hands to the ropes with the reverence of untying a family heirloom from a hitching post. Which first? He whispered, because order is how you keep your promises from turning into accidents. Left over right, Thomas said, and added, the way we were taught, which is what teachers say when they mean the way the world has survived so far. As the figure eight loosened, the pressure in the room eased, a notch, and the spoon chimes took an easier breath, ringing not in alarm, but in acknowledgment, the way a polite neighbor nods at your mailbox. The scene brightened, not wider, just clearer, like glass polished with a sleeve, and through it the quarry's water echoed a circle again, even though no bell sounded and no stone fell. The radio carried a smaller sound then, a tick not from any deer in the tower, a watch wound by fingers that respected tiny teeth, a patient thing that knows how to keep time for a body that might forget. We kept it, Elena said, and I understood that somewhere between, a small wrist still wore a small circle of time, running bravely on job it had not been hired for. We can meet you at the Linden or the bridge, Thomas added, but only when the town is counting with us. We'll take the bridge, the clerk said, surprising herself. then not being surprised anymore, because some people volunteer at exactly the right time and then spend the rest of the week carrying the cost like a well-packed bag. Not all of us, the bell-keeper said, practical and kind in the same sentence. Someone must stay to keep 9 from turning into the wrong 10. And the usher nodded, hands on rope, shoulders ready to be a promise for as long as shoulders can hold. I lifted the chassis, the brass plate warm as breath, and the seam quivered like a tight string before a pluck, then held, as if it had learned to be a window and liked itself that way. We left the radio in the pew, glowing like a small hearth, and stepped into the night that towns make when they're trying not to wake the part of themselves that scares them. The clerk carried the thermos and something else in visible resolve. Maybe, or the weight of telling a thing right later to people who didn't come. The bridge at midnight is mostly water and rumor. The rail held the day's warmth like a memory and gave it back to our hands in pieces. The spoon chimes were still, obedient as children sleeping on a car ride home, and the willow's shadow ran out into the river like ink that had decided to forgive paper. Between 2 and 3, I said, and placed the recorder, not because we needed proof, but because sometimes machines remember more politely than people do. The clerk set the thermos beside it and unscrewed the lid just enough that steam made a small white flag the air could read. From the church, faint but sure, the first toll arrived with the authority of a town that knows how to say its own name. 1, and the river's surface crisped, small scales of light flipping like fish that were only light. 2, and the spoon chimes rang though no wind came down the channel, a single polite note as if a guest had knocked with one knuckle. Now, the clerk whispered, and we both said her name like a compass point, and the sound landed on the far bank and seemed to stand up and dust itself off, and look around for the path home. 3 did not arrive for a long second that lived like a year, and in that absence a narrow cold moved across us, not winter, not fear, but the chill of a room when someone opens a freezer and considers the food inside for too long. Then 3 came, late and exact, and with it 2 figures where the path meets the willow's roots, clearer than before, their edges no longer misaligned, but stitched, like a double exposure deciding to be one photograph. "Don't finish," I said to my own mouth, in case it tried to help by ruining everything. The clerk breathed in counts that weren't numbers, the way singers do when they measure measures by the feeling in their ribs. The spoon chimes marked nothing at all, and then, as if instructed by a teacher you trust with your life, marked the smallest half-beat between 4 and what might have been 5. The figures looked at us in the way you look at a house you've lived in long enough to know where the floor creaks and where the light switch is too far from the door. They stepped, not forward, not back sideways into the seam of air a person can use if they've learned which part of the world to listen to when it asks for exactness. 4 sounded behind us from the tower and ahead of us from the water, 2 clocks making a treaty across a river. And in that treaty, I felt the town agree to something it hadn't been formally asked. The figures came level with the middle of the bridge, without moving in any way a shoe would understand. And the clerk's hand found mine because some grips are engineering, not comfort. "Name, sound, promise," she said, steady as nails, and together we said their names. And the spoon chimes answered with a note that made the hair on our forearms stand up like short grass in a storm. "We will not finish the count," I said, and the river made a 10th ring under the bridge, as if to say it would carry what needed carrying if we did our part. "Step through the window, not the door," the clerk added, which is either theology or carpentry, depending on the decade you learned it. 5 gathered itself, saw it wasn't wanted, and hung back like a guest who reads a room. And in that courteous pause, the 2 shapes resolved into people with history and temperature, and the kind of posture you get from years of making small things work with your hands. Elena's hair took the river's scant light and made it into a reason. Thomas's shoulders carried the whole narrow town for one heartbeat, and then set it down again where it belonged. "Don't say it," he said, meaning the number and meaning other things. 2, don't say we're saved. Don't say we were foolish. Don't say you're sorry that you slept. The bridge hummed like a tuning fork after it's been struck and forgiven, and the spoon chimes decided to be quiet in honor of the moment. The 5th never arrived, not as sound. It arrived as choice, and we did not give it a word to ride in on. They were almost with us, one more half-step of air to cross, a pain to thicken into nothing, and then from the church rolled a late, heavy tone that did not belong to St. Adalbert's, or to any clock that keeps a town honest, a 10th first river-made, door-shaped sound that asked, too calmly, for a different bargain. The late, heavy tone rolled under the bridge like a slow animal changing its mind, and everything that had been window began considering door. The way a conversation hardens when someone brings money into it. The figures paused at the scene's bright edge and looked like people again temperatures, weights, decisions rather than the suggestion of people made by a generous mind. The clerk's grip tightened, not in fear but in arithmetic. She was counting costs the way practical hearts do when wonder threatens to spend the rent. Not that way, she said, as if to a child about to choose the wrong aisle. And the 10th knot bell under the bridge pressed up again, patient and wrong. Windows let light change a room, I heard myself say, and it came out like instruction rather than poetry, which is how the right sentence behaves when it matters. We hold at 9, the clerk added, with the firmness of a vow that has been practiced in smaller rooms for lesser stakes. The spoon chimes registered a tiny syncopation late by a hair, then early, as if the town's own motif was adjusting, displacing its rhythm to stay with us rather than the river. On the far bank, the willow's leaves lay flat, not from wind but from attention, the way a crowd falls quiet when the bow lifts. The figures Thomas and Elena, not metaphor but fact, took a half step. There was not a step so much as a decision allowed by a seam, and the pressure around my ears eased by the degree you measure with gratitude rather than instruments. The late tone tried one more time to make a door of what we were keeping a window, and the recorder on the rail captured it honestly, placing its low shape on the graph like a handprint you don't invite, but keep for evidence. Trade, the cold intention under the bridge seemed to say again, and the clerk shook her head once, small and absolute, because bargains offered by water at midnight ever price what they sell in dollars. What do you take instead? I asked the air, not to invite, but to force its hand. Naming is leverage, and the between respects leverage, even when it pretends to be immune. The answer came as absence rather than voice. The spoon chimes refused to ring where the 10th would demand. The willow refused to flutter. The bridge held its quiet like a line held taut between two boats. Denied, the river bell subsided to a throb and became part of the bedrock hum, no longer a bitter but a current. Now, the clerk said, and together names sound, promise, we set the terms again, the names clean and whole. The chime's single polite note with no wind, and the held silence at 9 that turned a threshold into glass. The scene brightened. Thomas's shoulders came through first, bringing the smell of chalk and machine oil, the honest classroom and honest shop. Elena's hand followed, small and strong, smelling of lemon and old circuits, the scent of second chances. The air gave like canvas taken off a frame. For a heartbeat, they were both half in and half out, and every sound in town leaned toward us, the tower's gear, the diner's door chime, the motel's bad refrigerator, each motif, answering the theme we had been playing for days. Then they were on the bridge. Temperature arrived with them, the kind you only notice when a person who is gone is here and the math of the room changes. Thomas gripped the rail the way men do when they test whether the world is still bearing weight. Elena touched the spoon chimes and smiled, because even miracles behave like small metal when they're close. Don't finish, he said again out of habit and principle, and the clerk laughed once, low, half relief and half warning at the very idea we'd relax now. We did not say 5, or 6, or 7. We stood inside the count like a house you don't step out of until the weather respects what you've built. From the church, the 8th came, clean. We held the 9th by not naming it. The river swallowed the counterfeit 10th and turned it into ordinary dark. When the scene closed, it did so like a window shutting against rain, not dramatic, just decisive, and the night became only night again, which is the most generous thing a night can be. Back in the nave, the radio sat torn and calm, its filaments dimming as if satisfied to have burned hot for the right part of the story. The usher, who had been a promise on 2 legs for longer than any man should be asked, let the ropes rest and sat heavily with the careful dignity of someone who will hurt later and call it a fair price. The bell-keeper checked the figure 8 we'd undone and tied it right again right, meaning safe, not neat, and laid one gloved hand on the beam in a thank you older than language. The clerk poured coffee that tasted like a porch light, finally deciding to stay on. Thomas and Elena stood under the plaque that tells bells how to behave, ring out for the living, ring soft for the lost, and read it the way people read their own names on stones they didn't choose. We heard you, Elena said to the room as much as to us. Through wood, through gear teeth, through the places sound goes when people get the numbers wrong. And the bell-keeper lifted her chin as if to say wood had done its part proudly. We thought together would be safe, Thomas said again, and the usher's face made the expression men make when they forgive you without saying so. How long? I asked, and immediately regretted the shape of the question, because time is a cruel unit to use on people who have just returned from its seam. Long enough for the between to learn our names, Elena said, which is the kindest possible way to explain infinity to a room full of clocks. We need to fix what leaks, the clerk said, practical as sweeping, and the bell-keeper nodded, already calculating ropes and braces, and the discipline it would take to keep 2 timekeepers from arguing loud enough to open a seam. We carried the chassis to the back and set it on a small table that once held pamphlets about bazaars and blood drives. Without the brass plate, it was only handsome junk, but with it, it had been a bridge, and you don't throw away a bridge you might need again. The plate had cooled to room, ordinary as a doorknob, and I put it in my pocket with the humility of a man pocketing thunder and calling it metal. The radio's torn cloth fluttered once as the heater kicked on, not a sign, just physics, which is a relief. We didn't celebrate. That isn't how you end counts like this. We walked together down the steps, 3 sets of shoes and 2 that had waited too long on a public stair, and the town made small noises as if to show us where we'd left off. A truck backing, a fox arguing with a lid, a train negotiating with its own length. At the bottom, the usher locked the door and patted the wood as if to tell it that while we were gone, it had guarded the right things. At the diner, the clerk placed 4 cups instead of 3 without thinking, muscle memory getting ahead of knowledge in the way hands do. Thomas wrapped both palms around his mug as if heat were a lesson, and Elena looked at the door sensor bell like it was a cousin she finally understood. There will be others, the clerk said. Not a threat or a prophecy, just a statement of how towns are. Then we'll teach them to hold at 9, the bell-keeper said, with the fatal cheerfulness of people who intend to invent a tradition by hauling it into existence with rope and coffee. When the night thinned toward morning, we walked them to the edge of their own address, where the porch light remembered its job without us asking. Elena paused at the threshold and touched the frame, feeling for the difference between window and door with her fingers, because once you've learned it, you don't want to forget. Thomas turned to me, and because he is a teacher, gave me homework. There's a place up at the quarry where the count is wrong even at noon. Mark it. Teach the town that numbers are like knives useful if you respect the edge. The house accepted them the way a well-made drawer accepts its own contents. No scrape, no protest, just the right slide. The porch light steadied. The door closed with the kind of sound that ends a story for the night, not for the book. And in my pocket, The brass plate lay against my chest like a cool coin, as if it had another toll to pay before we could call any of this resolved. Morning thinned the night into something ordinary, but ordinary doesn't restore what windows learn when they've almost become doors. And the brass plate against my chest felt like a coin that had paid for one crossing, but knew the toll road wasn't done with us yet. At the diner, someone had righted the sugar packets and squared the napkin holder, small denouements in chrome that told a bigger one how to behave. The clerk handed a pad and said, "Loose ends," the way an accountant might say ledgers. Emotional arithmetic is a craft in towns like this. You don't leave debts of sound or promise on the books. And if you do, the bells adjust your interest. We listed what needed finishing, not because lists save you, but because they keep you from pretending you're done. Retie the ropes true. Mark the quarry seam. Teach the count. Repair the radio cloth. Return the shoes to where gratitude can find them. Tell the story right without making it bigger where it should be smaller. The usher set his coffee down with that careful dignity that makes porcelain seem like part of a ritual, and said, "We start at the tower, because Act 4 belongs to the place where Act 1 made its first promise." The bell-keeper nodded and added, "And we finish at the river, because endings mean more when the motifs that carried you there answer each other across distance like old friends." In the tower, daylight made honest what midnight romanticized. Dust motes, rope fibers, the little betrayals of metal on old wood. We untwisted the figure 8 for good and set the lines with a teaching knot, not just safe but instructive, the kind that shows its purpose to hands that haven't learned it yet. The bell-keeper chalked marks at shoulder height. Stop here. Don't rush the fall. Let the beam breathe, so that the count would be held by shared muscle memory rather than folklore alone. "People keep time," she said. "Clocks only keep people honest." And the usher smiled at a truth he'd lived long enough to not need explained. At noon, we met at the quarry, where water keeps secrets and returns what it shouldn't on days it thinks no one's watching. Thomas measured the dead noon shadow of a rusted post and marked the place where, even at 12, the count went soft, a hush like a skipped heartbeat. No bell, just the idea of a bell that some men would follow into the water if they weren't taught better. We set a sign without superstition white letters on a green board. Hold at 9, then below. Smaller. Windows, not doors. And people read it as if it were a safety instruction on machinery they'd always used, but only now understood. In the nave that afternoon, the seam was gone, which is to say, it had become properly invisible, and the radio's torn cloth waited on the pew like a wound that had decided to be a scar. Elena spread the fabric and held it to the light. "Leave it," she said, with the authority of someone who understands that repair can also be erasure, and that some marks are the invoice for what you owed and finally paid. We tucked the chassis into a wooden case the usher found in a back closet, the kind that once held hymnals and now held a bridge wrapped in towel, like a tool you only take out when the river's math goes wrong. There was still the matter of the shoes. At the clerk's insistence, we set them on the step where they had waited a brief ceremony of return, and the town passed as towns do, pretending not to look while looking, and making adjustments in their pockets to how they would tell this later. A woman in a blue coat, who had once stopped mid-crosswalk when the bells called her name, paused, lowered her voice to the pitch church's train-in children, and said, "Ring soft," to no one in particular, and everyone exactly. The usher carried the shoes inside and placed them under the donor wall as if returning borrowed, tools at the end of a job you didn't think you'd finish. At sundown, Thomas and Elena unlocked their door together, both hands on the same key without needing to choreograph it. Inside, the radios on the bench looked like cities at dusk, waiting for their first lights. Elena dabbed lemon oil on a rag and touched one cabinet, then another, not polishing, just greeting. "Second chances," she said, and the room answered by smelling like an apology accepted. Thomas set a small metronome on the shelf, wound it, then ticked it one notch off true. "We'll teach it back," he said, slow, "because sometimes you don't fix the seam. You teach the timekeepers to like each other again." That night, we held a quiet lesson in the nave. For whoever came, no flyers. No sign-in, just the town's rumor doing the work of a bulletin. The bell-keeper spoke about rope, like it was a language older than our coins. The usher taught counting without numbers. The clerk taught how to pour and listen at once, and when to hand someone a napkin before they know they'll need it. I told the part one could tell without daring the door to open again. That sound goes first and last. That names are bridges if you say them right. That promises are architecture. A man from the hardware store brought felt pads for the pew feet. A kid from the high school brought a screwdriver set, and the particular hope teenagers have when adults treat them like apprentices instead of problems. We chalked the words "hold at 9" on the inside of the tower hatch where only people who needed to see it would. No one wrote a miracle on a clipboard. No one tried to make folklore official. We just adjusted the town's habits by a degree, the way you adjust a door strike so a latch finds home without force. Near midnight, standing under the linden, the clerk said, "There's one thing left," and handed me the brass plate. On its back, under a smear of time, a few engraved letters we hadn't noticed before glinted when the porch light across the street hiccuped. Bell. A joke?" I said. "An instruction," she answered, and for the first time since the Count had nearly taken us, I laughed without flinching. We set the plate not in a frame, but in a drawer in the sacristy, wrapped in the napkin that had failed, and then redeemed itself by carrying more work than it was made for. The drawer closed with the modest confidence of wood that knows it has done its duty. On the way out, the usher tapped the plaque, "Ring out for the living, ring soft for the lost," and added, in a whisper the nave kept for us, "Hold at 9, which is how traditions begin, quiet, local, stubborn. The town slept like a town that has learned a song it will sing to itself for a while." On the far tracks, a freight negotiated its length and let us hear only the part of its argument that mattered. The river kept its counsel. The bells kept their hour. And somewhere between the 7th and the 8th, something listened and decided to be a window for another day. By morning, the town had learned how to carry quiet without dropping it, and even the trains seemed to edit themselves, letting only the useful part of their argument reach us. The brass plate lay in the sacristy drawer, wrapped in the napkin that had failed, then redeemed itself, and the radio, torn and dignified, waited on the pew like a witness who would testify again if asked kindly. Thomas said the metronome at home had begun to keep true when no one watched it, then slip a hair when someone leaned in like a dog, pretending not to understand sit until it decides you've earned obedience. Elena said the lemon oil wasn't about shine. It was about sent away to remind wood of its better self. There were letters to answer, too, though no paper changed hands. The usher had the sort of errands old men undertake when they've seen storms. He checked porch lights. He tightened the screws that had worked loose on a handrail by the linden. The bell-keeper wrote side notes in chalk on beams that had never been asked to read short. Plain sentences like, "Breathe between 7 and 8, and be kind to the soft shoulder under the rope." The clerk taught 2 teenagers how to refill sugar without banging the glass. The same lesson in smaller clothes. Windows, not doors. People came steady and unannounced. A man with a railroad badge asked whether he should count crossings the same way, and the usher told him yes, but never alone. A widow from the edge of town brought a paper bag with apple fritters and confessed she had once finished a bell count under her breath against her will, the syllables sneaking out like heat in cold air. The clerk put a napkin in her hand before she knew why she'd need it. At noon we walked the ridge to the quarry again, not to test it, but to mark the places where ordinary holds. The water behaved like water. No circles argued. The sign we'd posted hold at 9 looked almost friendly, like a rule you don't mind abiding because it makes a room kinder for the next person. Thomas paced the shore and measured a new quiet he hadn't earned yet, then stopped at a patch of rock where someone had left a draw knife decades ago and said, "This is where the count goes wrong if you swagger." So he wrote, in small letters only those looking would see, "Don't swagger." That night, a train pulled long and late, and in the pause between horns, the town did a thing towns do when they realize they've invented a ritual and it might keep them. They practiced it. In kitchens and on stoops, men and women counted in their chests to 9 and then held, letting the 10th be the river if the river insisted. The practice didn't feel like fear. It felt like manners. It felt like the kind of courtesy people used to teach in shops and sanctuaries, how to hand a sharp tool to a friend, how to lift on the leader's call, how to leave your shoes pointed toward a door only when you mean to return. Around midnight, the clerk asked for the chassis. "Once," she said, "with the lights on, with coffee and the back door open, like decent people." The usher sat with us in the 3rd pew, his shoulders no longer braced to hold the town alone. The bell-keeper took the gloves off and placed them beside the radio, the way a surgeon sets instruments away when the hard part is done. Elena slid the brass plate into its bridge, and the filaments rose like porch lights again. We did not summon. We did not say names like keys. We didn't even watch the clock. A hum came anyway, modest, content to be background if we allowed it. Then, like a neighbor leaning into a screen door, Thomas said, "If it asks for trade again, say no." And we smiled, because he was here to say it himself. A soft clatter followed a tiny screwdriver, rolling and stopping, as if placed by a careful hand, and Elena laughed in that low way that says some griefs convert to gratefulness if you teach them. "Will it open again?" The clerk asked. "Everything opens," the bellkeeper said. "We learn when to close it kindly." A week later the town met in the nave without announcing why. The usher read the plaque aloud, as if speaking the rule puts oil in its hinges. A woman in a blue coat pinned a small card beneath it with straight pins from a sewing tin. "Hold at 9. Someone had written the same words on the underside of the linden bench. On the bridge, the spoon chimes had acquired a new note, a lower one that spoke only when a child was on the rail, maybe because children finish nothing alone, not even a cookie. There were other cases, because the world is built with seams, and people, being people, step where they shouldn't, and also where they must. A boy said he heard a 10th in the laundromat between cycles. A mail carrier swore the slot, and number 12 counted letters wrong on windy days. We showed up with coffee and small tools, and the patience to listen for the difference between window and door. We taught the count. We left chalk. We reminded the rooms they were rooms. In time, the brass plate stopped feeling like a coin, and more like a tool you borrow and return better than you found it. We did not polish the radio cloth. We let the tear be a story that doesn't ask to be retold every time. The metronome on Thomas's shelf found its true tick, and then learned to live a hair off again whenever a guest leaned in too hard. He called it a teaching aid and flicked it back with a finger. Elena built a small radio from a wooden cigar box and gave it to the clerk, who tuned it at dawn while counting out the morning's receipts, both tasks done at the same quiet speed. As for the shoes, sometimes they are under the donor wall, and sometimes they aren't, which is how you know a story didn't end so much as agree to be lived with. On certain mornings, a pair will be lined up on the step, sometimes new, sometimes cracked and patient-pointed toward the red doors. No one bags them. No one tags them. People touch them lightly as they pass, the way you touch a banister, not for balance, but for blessing. Once, near winter, a storm took the power for a long night, and the bells refused to be bullied by the outage. We held at 9 by candle and by breath. In a hiccup of wind, the spoon chime spoke, and for half a heartbeat, everyone in town turned their heads the same way, Like sunflowers, and listen to the seam be nothing at all. If there's a lesson, it isn't the kind that looks good on a poster. It's closer to a shop rule on a smudged wall. Count with company. Fix what leaks. Let windows be windows. Don't swagger at the water. Never finish the wrong thing alone. The rest is rope and wood and coffee and the names you can say like bridges. And on mornings when the bells begin before dawn and argue with themselves like two clock hands disagreeing over the hour, people don't hurry the count. Between the 7th and the 8th, the town breathes in and decides again, gently and together, to live like a window held on purpose, letting light change the room, changing no one's address unless asked, ringing out for the living, ringing soft for the lost, and holding kind and stubborn at 9.